Hello everyone, so what a powerful game from the young Faustino Oro. Let me remind you, he's only 12 years old and this game is powerful, but it also reignites a lot of passion for following chess. Let's take a look at it. So, Faustino Oro is playing black. That's why I put it from the black side, because the performance he's about to deliver is truly impressive. His opponent starts with the pawn to a4. He plays e5. Knight f3, attacking the central pawn. Knight c6, we defend, that's standard. And now white are going to play. Knight c3, and the game is heading into a 4 knights opening. White play, bishop b5. And here Faustino Oro is going to play a move that's not among the main lines in theory. The move bishop b4 is played a lot here. Sometimes the bishop stops at c5, pawn d6, pawn a6. But no, Faustino Oro is going to play bishop d6. So we can understand, because if white take the knight on c6, the pawn on d7 will recapture. And the bishop on d6 ensures the protection of the pawn on e5. And moreover, recapturing with the pawn from d7 to c6 allows the bishop on c8 to be freed. But nevertheless, a question arises. If white don't take the knight, how will black activate the bishop? c8, we'll see that in the game. White play d3, kingside castling. Here, Faustino Oro plays h6. I think he wants to prevent the bishop from coming to g5. And here, white are going to play bishop a4. The move a3 is also often played in this position. Why these two moves, by the way? Because in reality, black are threatening to get rid of the light-squared bishop by playing a 6. And if the bishop comes to a4, then b5, bishop b3, knight a5. And the bishop can't avoid the exchange. If it comes to d5, it can be exchanged by the knight on f6, or you can even play c6 as an intermediate move. So in this position, black are threatening this sequence. A 6-b5 followed by knight a5. So when white play bishop a4, they are preemptively retreating from the attack. And if black play a6, white will play a3. By the way, in order to always be able to keep their bishop on the white square, and not be forced to take the knight, which would free the bishop c8 after recapturing with the pawn from d7 to c6. So what if black play rook e8? And here, up to now, there have been a few games in this position, and most of the games that have been played continued with the development of the bishop to e3. But here, white are going to play knight d5, and Faustino takes the opportunity to capture the knight. Then we recapture, and he plays knight e7, and he attacks the pawn d5. If white protect with c4, we will play c6 anyway to attack the pawn d5. And we always hope that white take on c6 to recapture with the d7 pawn and free the bishop. That's why white won't play c4. They'll play d4 and counterattack the pawn on d5. They attack it twice, so capture on d4, knight recaptures. And here there's a little trap, a little positional trap that consists of letting black take on d5, which Faustino Oro won't do. He doesn't fall for this trap, so that white can then continue with knight to f5. And as a result, the queen attacks the knight. You can't protect it with e6, otherwise you'd lose the bishop. And if the knight moves away, then the knight on f5 can take the bishop on d6. And after the recapture, the queen will take back the pawn, and this position is favorable. For white, they have the pair of bishops, and the d7 pawn is an isolated and backward pawn in the position. So it's an advantage for white. That's why in this position, Faustino Oro is not going to take the d5 pawn. He fears the arrival of the knight on f5 and the opening of the file. So he's going to play c6. He's still waiting for white to take the pawn on c6 so he can recapture with the pawn from d7. But here, white play c4. So it's still the same, you can't take, and here it would be even worse, you'd lose a piece. Pawn takes, knight takes. There would be knight to f5, attacking the bishop on the dark square, and the queen attacking the knight. So as a result, after c4, Faustino retreats the bishop to c7. And now they're threatening to take on d5, by the way. Capture on d5. Because when the knight recaptures, after a move by the knight to d4, the bishop on d6 would no longer be attacked along the file. And that's why white play queen h5. They bring their queen close to the king, creating threats with the bishop. Takes on h6, but at the same time they also defend the d5 pawn. Faustino plays knight g6, bringing in defenders, bringing back the knight, but also the queen. Knight f5 is played. So this move with the knight to f5, it's very aggressive. And in this position, it's hard to imagine that black will win. A brilliant game and a beautiful attacking game. Because in this position, it's actually white who are attacking. The knight is about to sacrifice itself on h6 or g7 so that the queen and the bishop can work together. But the knight is also ready to support the d6 pawn push. I know it's black's turn to move, but let's look at the threat. White are threatening to push this d6 pawn, so the bishop has to get to safety, for example. Bishop to b6, and now knight takes on g7. The queen takes on h6 with check, and the arrival of the bishop on g5 is devastating. The bishop attacks the queen, and the queen has no square. And if you play f6, you lose the knight g6 to a check again. The pawn d6 is very painful in the position. It is really a pin, a stake in the position of black. So we understand that this arrival of the knight in f5 can threaten sacrifices in g7, but also the push of the pawn in d6. That's why Faustino Oro brings out his queen in f6. He comes to defend g7 and doubles the protection of the pawn on d6. White play bishop d2, they're getting ready to play bishop c3. So rook e5 counterattacking the knight on bishop c3. Now to take the knight on f5 by attacking the queen. That's why white come to defend their knight with bc2, but we push the pawn d6 and that frees up. Finally, the bishop c8, even though it's true that it traps the bishop c7. But the bishop c7 can become active again by coming to b6 anyway. And so we have this triple attack against the knight. g4 is played, capture on d5, then we recapture. And here you absolutely must not take the pawn on d5 with the rook. Yet one might think, great, we take the pawn on d5 with the rook and attack the bishop. The rook ends up unprotected, directly facing the white queen. And so that would allow white to play. Knight takes h6, check, and after the recapture, the queen can seize the rook. So, in this position, black do not touch the pawn on d5 and continue their development. Bishop to d7. This will allow the other rook to become active. White plays rook to d1, indirectly defending the pawn on d5 and getting ready to defend it directly, even though, as we've said, black can't take it for now. Rook to e8, both rooks are now on the file. The queen comes to h3, and finally, we see that black have repelled white's attack. Now they will be able to start attacking themselves. Bishop b6, the bishop finds an interesting diagonal again, and now white play a4. They intend to play a5 to force this bishop to retreat. And this is where Faustino Oro prepares his diabolical plan. He plays rook c8, he puts pressure on the bishop. So queen d3 comes to defend this bishop. And I invite you to pause the video to calmly look for Faustino Oro's move in this position. And then we'll discuss it. So what did he play? Faustino Oro a very joli coup qui va être suivi d'une autre belle idée. But patience. He's going to play rook prend knight in f5. After all, the white knight was the most active piece for white, so he eliminates this knight. He knows that the queen can't take because of the bishop, so it's the pawn that recaptures. And then he brings his knight to e5. And suddenly we understand that the white position becomes critical. Because who has the most insecure king? It's the white king, actually, now, with the absence of the g-pawn and the opening of the file. We see the bishop well placed on the diagonal, the knight on e5, which is very well placed, attacking the queen, and it can't be chased away by the f4 pawn push, because there's the bishop on the diagonal precisely, the pawn on f5, which is attacked twice, and the queen has to move while still protecting the bishop. So sure, white have an extra rook, but the black knight is really very well placed, and white have a bad pawn structure, poor shelter for the king, and are even under attack. So the queen comes to b3 to protect the bishop. And now I invite you to find Faustino Oro's second brilliant move. So you can once again pause the video. So did you get it? After the sacrifice of the rook on f5, we're going to have the sacrifice of the other rook on c2. Magnificent rook takes, bishop c2, queen takes, and bishop takes f5. And if we understand it, it's true that black have sacrificed both their rooks. But in exchange for the two rooks, they have the bishop on the white square and the knight, while the king is in a very weak position on the white squares since the pawn on g2 is gone. And the idea is that we attack the queen, the bishop moves to e4 to support the arrival of the knight on f3. To check the king, and as soon as the king moves to h1 or g2, it will be under the sight of the other bishop, not to mention that the queen can sometimes participate in the attack, and that the f2 pawn will not be able to block the attack, because it is itself pinned on the diagonal. And so what I'm saying is that the four black pieces can launch an assault on the white king, who is poorly protected. And the two white rooks are really unable to provide any real defense. So now the white queen has to escape. Since she's under attack, she plays c3 and bishop e4. And as you can see, we're going to threaten knight f3. And there's nothing to stop this move. Let me remind you that the other bishop is pinning the pawn on f2. So white play queen to g3, but they're going to resign right after this move. Knight to f3, check. White resigns. What do you expect them to do? We can take a quick look. But the king is under attack and is forced to move in front of the light squared bishop. For example, to g2. And here we can play. Knight takes bishop, check, attacking the rook. For example, pawn to f3, knight takes rook and attacks the queen. So maybe white can recapture. Here, we can continue the attack. Queen takes b2, check. If the rook comes to f2, it can be taken by the bishop. So for example, king chain. And bishop takes d5. And this position is unplayable for white because black have the pair of bishops, which is stronger than the rook in this open position. The white king is less well protected than the black king and black. They have 3 more pawns. So it's a disaster, obviously, this position. I'm replaying the critical moment, the moment that turned the game around with the sacrifice of both rooks. Rook takes knight, pawn takes. The knight, which establishes itself on a superb centralized square, the queen is attacked and shifts to b3 to protect the bishop. The second exchange sacrifice to capture the f5 pawn. And the 4 black pieces are much more active than the 4 white pieces. And here, the white king is in incredible distress after the idea of bishop e4. Now the queen has to move, she's under attack. And so bishop e4 with the idea knight f3. And there's no defense. The attack will be too powerful. So what did you think of this game by Faustino Oro? It's the second one we've seen from him in this Tata Steel tournament. It was a long game, a game where the players had 2 hours. This Tata Steel tournament brings together quite a few very strong players, but also young talents. I've already published a few videos about this Tata Steel. If you haven't seen the previous video about the young Faustino Oro, I invite you to click on the link above. That way, you can get familiar with his attacking style. And if you enjoyed the video, you can give me a thumbs up, leave comments, share it, and support the channel. Goodbye, everyone.